Okay, get started.
Amen.
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, welcome everybody here in the room and those of you in Zoom land. Thank you for tuning in to this, our seventh session of this year's Great Decisions program. The topic tonight, as you know, because you tuned in, is climate migration. And I am delighted for many reasons to have the speaker we have this evening. If I stand close, you can hear me but can't see me. Now it should be okay. Erica Bauer is a graduate student entering her what she expects will be the final year of her PhD program in sustainable development, sustainability at Stanford. That this is a subject that she has worked on, she tells me, for 10 years. So I think we're in for a well-informed and in some respects challenging presentation this evening. So again, if you have questions out in Zoom land, use the chat function and Lou will moderate those when we get there, and we'll take questions from the audience in the room. So thank you, Erica, for doing this. You may have to reposition to see you since I'm taller.
All right. Hello, everyone on Zoom land, and hello, everyone in person. It's really great to be here, and I'm really honored to have been invited by Tom for what I think will be a hard but challenging, but also thought-provoking conversation. So as Tom mentioned, I've been working on climate change and human mobility and forced displacement, voluntary migration, planned relocation of communities for the last 10 years, so since 2013. And I've done this wearing a range of hats. I spent 2 years at the United Nations Refugee Agency in Geneva, where I was in the protection policy and legal advice section. I've worked for the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which is the actor that creates all the statistics that I'm sure you've seen, 24 million people displaced each year. And most recently, I've been working on my PhD here at Stanford, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But to start out, I want to get personal and tell you, great.
The cursor.
Perfect. I want to tell you about my aunt and uncle's house in Santa Rosa, California. They lived right on that road in the center, near the stretch of tan. And I'm sure many of you remember the year 2017, when the Tubbs fire came to the area. At 3:01 a.m., a neighbor came and pounded on their door, shouting fire. And they grabbed their passports, they grabbed their laptops and their external hard drives, and they were able to flee the flames. And now it's been 5 years, and they're back on their feet. My aunt and uncle are the lucky ones. They have insurance. They have the ability to access support systems from their government, from their community. But many around the world haven't had those same opportunities. And I share this to illustrate that climate displacement is not this future hypothetical in some faraway land that will only take place in 100 years. It's something that's very much here and now in our present, and it affects human beings. So behind all these numbers and statistics are intensely human stories. It's your uncle, it's your friend, it's your neighbor, who we can all relate to. And it's people who—
Yes, get your feet on the ground, say something.
Oh.
Somebody used to.
Okay. I share this also to illustrate that a protection perspective focused on human dignity is essential when we think about these issues. So here are some global statistics. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, 23.7 million people were displaced from their homes in the year 2021 alone. A significant portion of these events, 22.3 million, were because of hazards that we know are growing in intensity and frequency because of climate change. So floods, storms, droughts. I have a question?
Can you just distinguish the blue from the orange, please?
Yes, so the orange is conflict-related displacement. So when there's war, for example, and the blue is the disaster displacement statistics. So it's approximately twice as many.
I have one more question. Did you count
Yeah.
the people whose homes were destroyed in these tornadoes? Like there was a huge tornado back in Mississippi a couple of weeks ago would they be included in these statistics?
Absolutely.
Repeat the question.
The question was whether or not these figures includes examples like a tornado that recently displaced people in the United States. And the answer is yes, they would be included in these statistics. So I show that to illustrate climate displacement is here and now and omnipresent. But this is an evolving conversation. Human beings have always moved. Back in the 1980s, the term environmental refugees was first introduced by El Hinawi and World Watch Institute. And in these early reports, there was a very simplistic causal equation. People assumed a massive disaster, a natural hazard, equals movement. There is no other option. In the years since 1980s, we've learned that there are a lot of different layers of complexity. There are many ways in which people are on the move in these contexts. So unlike the singular depiction from many years ago, today we have a more pluralist understanding of the relationship between climate change and human mobility. So what are these layers of complexity? Well, first, there are a range of different climate change hazards that all have very unique implications for how people move. So there are some hazards that are sudden onset, the fires that I just referenced, a landslide. There are others that are much more gradual. Think about sea level rise or coastal erosion, drought, desertification. These are hazards that are taking many, many, many decades to actually appear for communities. And it means that people are trying to move in a much more gradual and intentional way, as opposed to forced displacement. We know that climate change increases the intensity and the frequency of these events. So these are sobering estimates from the IPCC report. And it shows that even a 1.5 degree increase, the bare minimum, will still involve dramatic implications for extreme weather events, including flooding including coastal and riverine flooding that have tragic implications for people's lives and their livelihoods in the places they call home. Another layer of complexity is what we call multi-causality. It's rarely environmental change alone, but rather the interaction between an environmental factor or a climate change impact on economic, political, social, demographic drivers that actually lead a person to migrate. So the causes of mobility are multiple, they're overlapping, they're intertwined, and there's both push factors in the place of origin, as well as pull factors in the destination site that combine. As any migration scholar will tell you, a third layer of complexity is this challenge between forced and voluntary movements. All movements fall along a spectrum. While law and policy may need us to have clear divisions to guide the allocation of limited resources, in reality, the line is really blurry. Most people fall somewhere in the middle. A third layer of complexity is the unit of analysis. There's a spectrum from movements that are just an individual to an entire nation, the island of Kiribati, for example, that's considering moving to Fiji. In other places, like the city of Jakarta in Indonesia, it's a city that's considering movement. In other situations, it's a village, or just a family, or just an individual. When you think about policy and governance, the scale has really important implications. And finally, there's the spectrum of the duration of movement. There are some short-term temporary movements, evacuation in the face of a storm. This is the Superdome after Hurricane Katrina. There are other movements that are cyclical, like seasonal labor migration as an adaptation strategy to cope with cyclones in Bangladesh. There are other movements that are permanent in nature. So Ile de Jean Charles, for example, in Louisiana, which is an entire indigenous village that's moving to the mainland in a permanent capacity because of sea level rise. And actually, an interesting point here. In many cases, what people think of as the most determining factor for international protection is whether a move is forced or voluntary. Refugees, forced movements, they should be eligible for certain protections, but migrants that are voluntary, they shouldn't be eligible for those protections. But I think a much more interesting and potentially relevant consideration in the context of climate change is this duration of movement, this permanency. Can people return? Is it safe for them to go back to their place of origin? Is that even an option when the island has disappeared? Is that even an option when there's been desertification? So I think that's a relevant consideration to keep in mind here. Another important element is distance. Are people moving locally? My aunt and uncle who moved from Santa Rosa to Petaluma, or are people moving within a country, within a state, or then are they crossing international borders? And we know that the vast majority of movements in the context of climate change are internal. People only cross borders when they have no other options, when they're seeking international protection, or when they've just run out of possibilities in their country of origin. And finally, I think it's important to consider the individual vulnerabilities that people face on the move because of their unique histories, their gender, their age, their level of ability, their ethnicity, their history of mobility. So I did some work for UNHCR with Rohingya refugees that were living in Bangladesh. So they already had a tenuous status, but then when a cyclone came, they were displaced a second time. So they were facing unique vulnerabilities because they weren't seen as nationals to the Bangladeshi government. So I think when we talk about what people's needs are when they're on the move in the context of climate change, the history of mobility is another really important dimension to consider. So within this landscape of 6 layers of complexity that I just illustrated, it's important again to acknowledge that there's not one single narrative of what it means to be a climate migrant or a climate refugee in the way there was in the 1980s. Instead, there are many parallel scenarios, many ways that people are on the move. So in the policy sphere, this is sort of the landscape of how it's most often discussed. According to language that was agreed upon by the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2010, the Cancun Adaptation Framework, there's 3 main types of movement. Displacement, which is situations where people are forced to leave their homes or places of habitual residence. Migration, which is moves that are predominantly voluntary, can be seen as an adaptation strategy. Think Dust Bowl, think people who are moving to cope with circumstances, but it's maybe a little bit more voluntary. And then finally, there are community-wide planned relocations, where an entire village or a community has been moved outside of their home, and ordinarily that's supervised by the state. I'm not quite sure why my slides keep advancing. I'm going to try to keep up with it, but it's kind of like a race to.
Might have an auto advance turn.
There might be an auto advance. It's kind of fun. It's like a one time right here.
One here.
Sure, that would be great. Okay, so thinking about internal displacement, I mentioned earlier that evidence shows the vast majority of people on the move in climate change and disaster contexts do not cross international borders. They're IDPs. IDPs are protected by the 1998 Guiding Principles and a number of regional conventions. And these principles include disasters and climate change, as well as conflict, the orange and the figure that I mentioned earlier. States have the primary responsibility to protect people when they're displaced within their country's borders. There's no gap in international law per se. There may be gap in the mandates of UN agencies. There may be gaps in actual support operationally, but there's no gap in the law. The international community is often called on to support in these circumstances. And again, just to illustrate what internal displacement looks like in the United States, here's a photo of the Superdome after Hurricane Katrina. Next slide. However, there are certainly circumstances where people cross international borders. So when I worked at UNHCR, the #1 most frequently asked question from journalists, from students, from colleagues in other agencies is, are these people climate refugees? This was the title of the presentation today. Well, we know that the definition of who is a refugee under the 1951 convention is something super specific. And the term climate refugee does not exist in international law. So that convention means that a refugee is defined as someone with a well-founded fear of being persecuted, who has crossed an international border and is outside of the country of their nationality, and who is fleeing because of reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So in most circumstances, people who are fleeing because of climate change don't fall into any of these categories, and they wouldn't be eligible. However, there are some exceptions, which I'll talk about in a moment. The second most frequently asked question is, okay, well, 1950s was a long time ago. Maybe it's time to update the convention. Isn't this clearly outdated? Unfortunately, in the world that we live in today, with a lot of xenophobia on the rise, if the convention was reopened and renegotiated, there's a risk that it would be even narrower, and the definition of refugee would be restricted further, and even people who meet this definition today wouldn't get protection. So there's a real reluctance on behalf of member states of the United Nations to even consider opening up this convention. And most agencies, most scholars, most activists have decided, no, the term climate refugee is probably not the best way forward. We probably can't change the convention, at least in the immediate future. Next slide. Yeah. However, there are some circumstances where people fleeing across borders in these contexts can be considered refugees. So these are two papers that I was a part of while working at UNHCR that basically look at people who are fleeing the nexus of both climate change, disasters, and conflict and persecution. In this context, also looking at the nexus between conflict and famine. And I know that the Great Decisions Group spoke about famine last week. So thinking about what it means when there's climate change exacerbating a famine, and then refugees are fleeing across an international border. For example, refugees who were fleeing from Somalia were escaping not only the Al-Shabaab insurgency, they were also escaping ongoing drought and famine. So when they came to Kenya, to Dadaab refugee camp, they were granted asylum. They were granted access to a permanent status as a prima facie refugee. Even climate change was a factor, but they weren't climate refugees. They were just refugees in this context. So I share this to illustrate that refugee law is one tool in the toolkit. It is one way that the issue of climate displacement can be addressed, but it's by certainly not a panacea, certainly not a universal silver bullet. It's just one dimension to consider. So I wanted to share a few insights about the limitations of UNHCR's engagement on climate displacement. UNHCR faces limits because of the definition of who's a refugee, the 1951 convention that I mentioned earlier. But there are also a number of other dimensions, three of which I've illustrated here. First, there's a lot of intergovernmental politics. Donor member states hold power. UN agencies have limited control over their own mandates. So when the United States is one of the biggest donors to UNHCR, what they believe should be part of the refugee definition and part of their mandate is really powerful. So the idea of expanding the convention is probably less palatable. Second, there are interagency politics in what some scholars call a humanitarian marketplace. There's competition between agencies that want to be the expert on the new issues. So IOM, the International Organization for Migration, for example, is to some extent in competition with an organization like UNHCR to see who will be the lead on this issue. And finally, there is intra-agency politics and a real resistance to changing the status quo, because this is the way things have worked for a long time, and UN agencies are really slow to change. So there's a real humanitarian approach that pervades the organization, which means there are short time horizons, there are immediate needs today, and the focus is, okay, 1 month, 2 months, maybe 6 months, but certainly not a slow onset hazard like permafrost melting or sea level rise or desertification. So there's really not a risk management approach in a humanitarian agency. Other organizations that are more future oriented, like UNDP, the development agency, or UNEP, the environment program, are more focused on these types of questions. Next slide. So there's a gap Climate displacement doesn't fit into UNHCR's mandate. It doesn't fit into the mandate of any organization. Here are a couple of the critical gaps. There is lack of legal and operational standards regarding whether people are allowed to cross borders in the context of climate change, whether people are allowed to stay, whether people are allowed to return to the place of origin. There's also a lack of established structures for cooperation between countries. There are unclear mandates of agencies, some of the challenges I mentioned earlier about UNHCR's work in this area. There are also weak cross-border cooperation and coordination mechanisms. And finally, there are gaps in funding, particularly regarding recovery and durable solutions. Next slide. So to fill these gaps, a series of initiatives and platforms have emerged. Back in 2012, the government of Switzerland and the government of Norway decided climate displacement is a critical issue. We can't let this fall off the radar. We need to do something. They held a series of regional consultations in all of the hotspots, in the Americas, in the Pacific, facing sea level rise, in the Horn of Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia. And I was involved in the South Asia consultations. They talked to government agencies across all of the ministries. They talked to civil society. They talked to academics. And what emerged after the series of 3 years is something called the Protection Agenda of the Nansen Initiative. Now, this is softer than soft law. It is not a new refugee convention, but it is a document that was endorsed by 105 governments that said, okay, this is the elements of what we need to do as an international community to address these challenges. Then in 2015, this document was, like many documents in the UN system, sitting on a shelf and not necessarily being implemented. And the government of Germany said, okay, this issue is so critical, we need to make sure that the recommendations in this protection agenda are followed up on by governments, but also by the UN system. So the Platform on Disaster Displacement was launched. And there's been a series of chairs over the years. Currently, it's the EU. Go to the next slide. So the Platform on Disaster Displacement is a really interesting stakeholder in this space for a few reasons. First, they focus on all types of disasters. Climate change hazards, those I mentioned earlier, but also geophysical hazards like volcanoes, like the earthquake, like earthquakes. So for example, when an earthquake happens in Haiti and people cross international borders to Brazil seeking protection of some sort, that would still fall under the mandate of the PDD. It's intergovernmental, so there's involvement of states. It's led by the EU currently, but there's also critical involvement of UN agencies, of civil society, and of academia. So just this past month, earlier in March, I was in Geneva for the Platform on Disaster Displacement Advisory Committee meeting. Usually this happens once every 2 years. Because of COVID, it's been happening once every 4 years, but it's a chance for this particular body to get up to speed with what's happening in academia, what's happening in research, and to jointly determine what the future of this organization should be. One interesting insight from that meeting in Geneva was that the mandate of the PDD is expanding. Well, there were recommendations for them to expand beyond just cross-border movements to also consider internal displacement and IDPs, given that that's where the majority of people are concentrated and where the needs are greatest. It's outside of the UN system, but it works closely with UNHCR and IOM. And most critically, it's a home for a topic that did not have an institutional home. There was no organization focused on climate displacement before the PDD. And it links to ongoing policy processes, which I'll talk more about in a moment. It's also critical to understand that the approach of this Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda is a toolbox. So we're talking about managing risks in the country of origin, trying to promote climate change adaptation, trying to promote disaster risk reduction, trying to promote protection for internally displaced people so they don't have to cross a border. People don't want to leave their homes. How do we make sure that the risks in the country of origin are managed to the greatest extent possible? But then also when people do cross international borders, how do we make sure that they're able to cross legally in a safe and regular manner? How do we make sure that their protection needs once they've reached a new country are being met? We can go to the next slide. The PDD is not the only stakeholder in this space. So Another critical actor to keep in mind is that the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, created something called a task force on displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. So loss and damage is what happens when we're beyond adaptation, when there are climate change impacts that have created harms such as displacement, and countries can no longer and communities can no longer adapt. What then? So the Displacement Task Force developed recommendations for integrated measures to avert, minimize, and address this challenge. And now these recommendations are being implemented. But there's a real reckoning now in the international community about how do we fund these types of losses and damages? What does that even look like? COP27 most recently created a loss and damage fund. But now there's a transitional committee that's tasked with deciding what next. How do we actually ensure that money is put into this fund? How do we allocate it? There are a lot of really thorny questions in the international community now about what does it mean to really support displaced populations on the ground in the context of climate change. So this is, just another stakeholder to keep in mind. You can go to the next slide. I share that the PDD and this task force on displacement under the UNFCCC exist to really illustrate two of these little circles around this challenge. And what I mean to illustrate here is that there's no single policy solution to address climate change and human mobility. We need to think about refugee protection. We need to be thinking about existing migration pathways. We need to talk about exceptional migration categories like temporary protection status here in the United States. There are really important considerations for cities. The New Urban Agenda, for example, is all about thinking how mayors and cities at a very local level can start to prepare for these challenges. We need to think about disaster risk reduction. The Sendai framework on DRR is a critical instrument in the international policy space that's tasked with helping governments and communities prepare for these challenges. I mentioned loss and damage and climate adaptation, which are two other critical instruments. There's also a lot of important considerations about statelessness. What happens when the sea levels have risen to an extent that the entire islands, the atoll island nation of the Maldives no longer has a physical land mass? The highest point in the Maldives is 5 meters above sea level. 80% is below 1 meter. Where are people going to go when the entire country has been inundated? Or even before sea levels have risen, the water supply will be completely will have saline intrusion, and it'll be really hard to live, hard to cope. So there's interesting questions about to what extent the Statelessness Convention might be applicable. Probably not the universal silver bullet solution, but another tool in the international policy toolkit. And again, IDP guiding principles, which I mentioned earlier. You can go to the next slide. Another tool in the toolkit of ways to think about this, addressing this crisis, is planned relocation. And this is the focus of my doctoral work here at Stanford. So planned relocation is the physical movement of an entire community out of harm's way to a new destination site on higher land. And it's usually referred to as a measure of last resort. It's not the first option that communities undertake. This is never, no one wants to leave their homes, but when there's no other option and you've built the seawall and you've put your house on stilts and no other in situ adaptation is going to work, a lot of communities around the world are already grappling with how do we relocate? But it has serious risks. In some cases, it can be a form of displacement. And it's really important that a participatory human rights-based approach is integrated, where communities are involved in deciding when to move, where to move, how to move. In 2015 and 2017, I was involved in supporting the creation of some guidance and a toolbox that was basically meant to provide some checklists of questions to consider when communities are trying to plan relocations. But there's a lot of knowledge and data gaps that were underpinning that guidance in that toolbox. And that's really why I came back to pursue a PhD, was trying to build the evidence that's required to support communities and governments that are planning relocations to make sure they do this well and they minimize those serious risks. We can go to the next slide. So as part of this work, together with the PDD, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, we did a global mapping. We looked at literature from all around the world in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese to understand where are these community-wide planned relocations occurring. And we found examples on every inhabited continent. But you can see that there are certain hotspots. So the island nation of Fiji, for example, has a disproportionately high number of these relocations. You can go to the next slide. Fiji is in many ways a canary in the coal mine. They've been taking this challenge of climate displacement and planned relocation really seriously. They've developed a national policy, guidelines on how do you can click the next slide. Yeah. What does a framework look like to undertake these climate change related relocations? They've also created a trust fund. They have a supply of money from a tax that's within internal, but also they're accepting donations from the government of New Zealand, for example, to support these moves. They've developed standardized operating procedures, SOPs, that help every single ministry in the government coordinate to undertake these relocations. And they've also most recently developed an assessment tool to comprehensively understand what the risks are in the country, in the places of origin, and what destination sites might be safer. And again, through supporting this actor, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, I've been involved. Honestly, it's been a lot of Zoom meetings at 8, 9 p.m. California time, trying to support the government of Fiji create this assessment tool. It's a decision support tool to help them integrate both climate change projections, the latest data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but also social science information, community-wide surveys that ask communities how climate change has already affected their livelihoods, how climate change has already affected their housing, how climate change has already affected the cultural sacred heritage sites, and then determine which communities are most in need of limited relocation funding. It was a crazy experience to be sitting there on this call where they were trying to debate how you compare cultural heritage loss across different communities. And they were trying to incorporate cultural heritage loss alongside just damage to housing, which is already a brilliant, I think, an insight that shows the Fijian government is really thinking about these challenges. But they were coming up with measures like percentage of temple inundation. And it struck me as kind of like, can we really compare the loss of a sacred site? There are villages that are digging up the bones of their ancestors and moving their graveyards to higher land. Is that, no government, no community should have to be grappling with these questions, and yet here they are. And it was sort of surreal to be sitting on this call and thinking, my gosh, I can share resources and insights, but I have no idea how to provide any insights about digging up bones of your ancestors. Wow, these challenges are real. Anyway, I share this just to say that Fiji is a canary in the coal mine, and the United States government is already thinking about similar challenges. They've recently provided funding for 12 Indigenous communities to start moving. Ile de Jean Charles is perhaps the most well-known. They received $45 million many years ago. I think it's important to know just these relocations are so expensive and they're so hard to do well. And I don't know if we have any best case evidence from anywhere in the world. We can go to the next slide. So there's a tendency amongst policymakers and practitioners to call certain planned relocation cases successful. And this has become my biggest pet peeve. We can click the next one. So here's an article about a village in Fiji. We'll click again. This is an article about a success story about the town of Valmeyer in the Midwest. And I see this word success and I just can't help but wonder, what does that mean? And that's what led me really to come here to Stanford. We can click the next slide. Again, this is an article written about this issue. So the question that I'm trying to grapple with in my PhD is, what is and what contributes to success across these planned relocation cases? You can click the next slide. there's obviously so many layers to consider here. Successful for whom and according to whom? Is it according to the community members that are trying to relocate? Is it according to the government actors? Is it according to a UN agency? Across space, are we comparing success relative to the host community that's in the place where they're moving? Or is success relative to the baseline of where they were before? Is success measured in the year 2030 or the year 2100? Is it for this generation or many generations? Globalization is causing continuous change in a lot of these small island contexts. How do you measure what is the success or an outcome of a relocation per se, relative to all of the other changes that happen when you get access to electricity and you get access to television and you get a new iPhone? But most critically, I think there's a real tendency to think about success just in terms of number of people moved or amount of hazard reduced, thinking about people's survival alone, but not necessarily thinking about what it takes for a human to thrive. So I think it's important to also consider so many other dimensions beyond just housing and limited exposure to sea level rise, thinking about people's access to livelihoods. We can click one more time. People's access to justice, perceptions of what is a just relocation, and also exposure reduction, among many others. We can go to the next slide. So in my PhD, I'm looking at, actually you can keep clicking here, a range of these dimensions. And I'll very briefly talk about two of these chapters now. Thinking about livelihoods, exposure, and justice. And then one more time. You can click. Again, the first chapter was that global mapping that I mentioned earlier. You can click. So exposure reduction. Does planned relocation meet this very basic definition of success? Does it actually make people safer in facing climate change hazards through the end of the century, through the year 2100? You can click one more time. So in this chapter, we mapped the locations of origin in yellow for 23 planned relocation cases around the world. You can see here one case in Gardi Sugdub in Panama. I'm actually going to visit Gardi Sugdub tomorrow morning. My flight leaves at 6 a.m. Tohola, which is a community in Washington State here in the US, Bunya de Lagoa in Fiji, and then Kantalahodu in the Maldives. And you can see in black the destination sites. So they're moving from the yellow to the black. And then what we did was overlay these maps with projections of sea level rise from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we're also looking at an annual flooding event. And we're trying to understand to what extent are these destinations actually less exposed than the origins. You can click one more time. What we find is that yes, on average, planned relocations do make communities safer. But less risk reduction is not the same thing as zero risk. So we see that as we go over time, the blue circles get increasingly large, not only in the origin, the first column of 3, but also in the destination sites, the second column of 3. So as we approach the end of the century, and as we approach more pessimistic scenarios of how much emissions will continue to be in our atmosphere, the amount of inundation in the destinations increases. But it's also critical to consider the role of geography. So the most vulnerable communities, you can click one more time, are small island developing states. Relocations in the Maldives, for example, from a small island to another small island are the instances where there's the highest level of blue, even in destination sites, in the year 2030 as well as in the year 2100. And this raises really critical questions for the international community about what does it mean to support? What would burden sharing look like in these contexts? It also raises interesting questions about whether planned relocation is a sustainable adaptation strategy for small islands that have no higher land to relocate to. Go to the next slide. But exposure reduction is really just one very limited entry point to what is a successful relocation for reasons I've already talked about. I think the next one. Okay, there we go. So in a second chapter, I'm looking at what planning decisions are associated with improved sustainable livelihoods for relocating communities. And I'm not going to bore you with the methods or the nuances of the actual research paper, but the outcome that's most critical is that the single most important factor in determining positive outcomes across 14 cases that were in this meta-analysis was community engagement. So when the community members have decided we want to relocate, and the community members have set up committees, and they are the ones that are deciding, okay, this is a destination site that's safe. This is a new place where we can develop a source of livelihoods, have jobs. This is the timing we want to relocate. The more the community is involved, the better the outcomes are. When it's a government actor or an NGO or a UN agency that's initiated the process, on average, sustainable livelihood outcomes are lower. This is an image of Grantham, Australia, which is a planned relocation that's received a lot of media attention, a community meeting where people were trying to pick out what destinations would be the most valuable for them. You can go to the next slide. So again, that was a bit of a detour on planned relocations, but I want to conclude with some musings about ways forward to address the climate change, human mobility nexus. As I mentioned earlier, there's very little political appetite for opening up the 1951 Refugee Convention, and it's probably not even the right solution for a lot of communities, especially those that are moving within a country's borders. There's no silver bullet solution. There is no easy, quick fix to addressing the challenge of climate refugees. Instead, what we have is a toolbox of strategies, including the ones that are listed in the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. And what we really need at the end of the day is greater coordination across all of those different policy spheres, thinking about climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction to help people stay home, but also thinking about refugee protection and new migration categories to help people cross borders when that's what they most want. We also need to think about greater coordination across
Sorry.
that's okay, across levels. So thinking about the hyper-local, a village that wants to relocate, thinking about the national, the regional, and also the international level. And most critically, I think we need to have greater coordination across time. There's a lot of focus on retrospective band-aids that are being put on displaced as solutions on, on people's lives. But at the end of the day, you think about the impacts of sea level rise or coastal erosion or desertification. These are long-term challenges, and what we really need are anticipatory risk management approaches that are thinking about long-term time horizons. So we need to have better coordination across time. So a final concluding quote, the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands at the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda global consultation said, to fail to plan is to plan to fail. And I think that's something we can all keep in mind when we're trying to grapple with what climate change will mean for generations ahead. Thanks.
You want to field your own question from in here?
That sounds great. Yeah. Thank you all. Yeah.
Well, you posed the question regarding in plan relocation and effective strategy. But my question is, what are the options?
Well, there's a lot of adaptation strategies that are in situ. So you can build a seawall, you can put a house on stilts.
Excuse me, could you repeat the question, please?
Apologies. The question was, is planned relocation an effective strategy? Well, what are the alternatives? What other options do people have? And the answer is, well, it's effective compared to what other adaptation strategies in place, like building seawalls or putting a house on stilts. But those are short term. They may work for 10 years. They may work for 15 years. But when you're thinking about, I'm 30. I'm thinking about where I want to live. I'm thinking about where I might want to one day have kids. Do I want to live in a place where I'm thinking about, what impacts are going to be for the next generation? I think it's a short-term strategy. Yeah. Yeah.
It strikes me that, it's a very complex problem across many cultures and countries and everything else. And yet, it sounds like the expectation is that we in one part of the world will be contributing to the solution for people in another part of the world, maybe with just money,
Mm.
maybe expertise. Seems to me people are gonna wear out worrying about what's happening in an island in the Pacific when they're dealing with what's going to happen when Florida gets overwhelmed. So the likelihood that, like that to me, just being able to sustain that care about somebody remote when you have your own problems in your own country is really, well, it's limited, I think. Anyway, it's just an overwhelming thing, and we're gonna focus on people in our own immediate sphere than people around the world.
Yeah, the comment question was about the balance of focusing on the needs internally within the United States. You mentioned Florida. Miami is one of the cities that's most that's likely to be most inundated by sea level rise. How does that compare to focus from the United States to countries overseas that are facing these challenges? I think you're right to point out that there's both and I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I also think the US has a lot to learn from other countries. Fiji, for example, is really paving the way with these assessment frameworks and has thought a lot more critically about what information is required to do a relocation well. The Philippines has developed early warning systems for tropical cyclones, and their ways of disseminating information to all of the residents in a certain city are really inspiring. Like my aunt and uncle didn't know when the fire was coming. Their neighbor had to knock on their door. But in Philippines, there are incredible ways to disseminate information for people to know. So I hear your point, and I take it. I think there are limited resources and limited amounts of compassion and care, but I think the US has as much to learn from other countries as they do from us. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to complicate it further. And it builds on the question about how we're going to worry about Cook Islands when we've got a problem at home. And it has to do with the search for the perfect integrated solution while the clock is ticking.
Yeah.
Are there steps that should have been taken a decade ago, should be taken tomorrow in order to mitigate and to make it specific?
Yeah.
Foster City is at risk. So is San Francisco Airport. Possibly within 15 years. Do you move Foster City or build walls? You build walls at Foster City, you flood the airport. That it has to be a big solution, an integrated solution. While we search for that big integrated solution, we don't act.
Yeah.
And we complicate it further with government policies like cheap flood insurance to live in places that you shouldn't live, given what is foreseeable. How do we get started? What's the argument here that is persuasive and get action sooner rather than later?
Yeah, Tom, you asked a great question. Just for those on Zoom, the question was about the trade-offs between the urgency of doing something now and the long-term quest for the perfect, integrated solution that probably doesn't exist. There are trade-offs. There is no universal silver bullet. I think what we need are many actors working at different stages. I think the framing of planned relocation only as a measure of last resort is problematic in some cases because they take a long time. They're expensive. in order to build towards that goal, you need to have resources and institutions, you know, to set up the conceptual frameworks today to make those things possible. So what are the arguments to get this? I wish I had answers to that. I think there's, I think one compelling argument is that will save you money in the long term. An ounce, a 10 cents today is $100 saved in 10 years, in 100 years. I'm making up those statistics. But the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Sendai Framework has this evidence. DRR works. We know that it's cheaper to prevent than it is to address after the fact. Other than economic arguments, I think you point to FEMA to flood insurance and how it's really cheap to stay where you are. I think another interesting insight is that the housing value for my aunt and uncle's home in Santa Rosa is now higher than it was before the fires, which strikes me as bizarre, that it's now even more desirable to live in this place that we know of already had fires twice, and yet people are still trying to live there. I think maybe it's the responsibility of local governments to create policies about areas where habitation should only be if people are fully aware of the risks that they're facing. But it raises questions for airports, for businesses. And I don't know if I have any insight beyond that prevention is more effective than reaction. So I'll keep thinking about that. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on an article we sent out how weekly this week about how all these adorable little houses have been built for shelter to get people off the streets. And then, within that framework, they were promised they could stay 4 months and then work with somebody to get permanent housing. But it turned out that very few people were able to get permanent housing. I mean, a small proportion of the entire bunch. And you could almost predict that, given the cost of housing here. How could you navigate that? A lot of those people were in shelters because they had no jobs or they had mental problems. I know I'm complicating it, but it's it's like, again, somebody tried to do something good, and then there were all this underlying stuff that got in the way. That's all I'm saying.
The comment was just about all of the overlapping challenges that communities face. For example, people who are already living in informal housing arrangements, who may be homeless or houseless, who then may be I'm imagining a scenario where they're facing a fire or a flood, and then they're displaced a second time, for instance. Absolutely, there are so many layers of challenge here, and sometimes people don't want the solution that's presented to them via government or by an NGO. And that's certainly real in the context of climate displacement. What an external stakeholder thinks is the answer may not be the answer that someone who's living in this experience wants. I don't have any coherent response other than just to say, yes, it's really complicated. Yeah.
Nancy has a comment and a question. Success, in quotes, the Kenyan Refugee Center has raised the problem of the goal is not to just quote unquote warehouse people, but how to create successful communities. For example, sustainability and self-sustaining situations. So with that background, her question is, if there is attention to the value, is there attention to the value of life after relocation? For example, urban planners, business development, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't have time to talk about this part of my PhD, but it's so much more than just housing. It's so much more than just minimizing exposure. I think what you point to about quality of life is critical. And it's often centered on communities. It's communities that are self-organizing, self-developing, that have a heritage center where they can have artifacts from the place where they lived before, from their tribal community, if it's an indigenous group. Also thinking about building community centers where people can gather and work together towards solving their own problems. I think there's a lot of value to be paid towards measures of community cohesion and social cohesion and networks, and using that as a metric of success beyond just dollars saved. But yeah, that's a really, really important point. And in the refugee context, which is maybe an analogy because there's a border that's been crossed, there's a lot of literature in the forced migration studies field about what makes local integration effective and livelihoods. Getting refugee communities access to jobs is like the single most important factor to helping people reestablish their lives in a new country. So it's more than just a house and a passport.
Well, just quickly, how much? I think inertia is probably a problem in this. How much does denial cause inertia?
Yeah, the question was about how much denial causes inertia. Do you mean denial of climate change
Denial
as like a human anthropogenic?
that there is such a thing and that there's something we could or should do about it.
Yeah, I think you point to an important point. There's so much that needs to be done today, to Tom's point.
But I mean, is there a lot of denial causing that inertia? Have you seen it?
I think there was 10 years ago. I think it's decreasing now. I think it depends what circle and what space you're in. I think more than denial of climate change, people see the flood. They experience the saline water. It doesn't matter whether anthropogenic climate change caused this. There's a disaster that's affecting people's lives today. And that's what they want to react to. Take climate change out of the picture.
But that's reaction, that's not future planning.
Yeah. I think people want to stay where they call home. People love the places and the communities where they live and where they've lived for generations. I think there's a reluctance to even contemplate the long term. And we see generational divides. So oftentimes these planned relocations are really exciting to young people. And understandably, my grandparents are in their 90s. They don't want to move. They don't think about the long term in the same way that I do. Yeah, I think the point that you make is a really important one. And I mean, everyone has their own definition of what is a habitable place. And I think allowing for that pluralist vision, allowing for multiple visions simultaneously is hard when you're a government planner or you're trying to allocate a budget. Yeah.
There was sort of a question brought up about why it should the United States be concerned when a lot of this is happening in other parts of the world. And I so personally have experienced this in my own family. My sister and brother-in-law had built this beautiful home in what is it, Fountain Grove area of Los Altos.
Yeah.
Santa
Rosa, yeah.
And they, like so many people, were told at 2:30 in the morning, you have 10 minutes to grab what you have and get out. And their house was completely destroyed. There's a bunch of ashes, that's it. And I've been so proud of my alma mater, which has was originally a normal school, and then Humboldt State college when I went there 50 years ago, and then Humboldt University, I think, And now it's become Cal Poly.
Hmm.
It's one of the three ones in California now, and it was given a tremendous amount of money by the governor because of all it's done, having to do with living with nature. They have a wonderful marine biology department. The students have their own boats, and they go out and do all the things that marine biologists do. And of course, forestry is something they were really famous for dealing with. But now they have a whole new program, and they're inviting students who are basically interested in science and engineering and how to prevent and deal with the huge problem of climate change and how it affects us. And of course, fires being the most common in California. But I just think it's so great that there's hope and that education is one of the solutions. Because the more education we all have, the less we'll be in denial and we'll know more about things that we've just been so, completely devastated by.
Yeah.
I'm really proud of that. And I decided to stop giving so much money to all of these things all my life that I have, like the, conversion campaign committees, all this kind of stuff. And I'm just going to narrow down what I'm going to be contributing to, and one of them is going to be my school. So, and the student program. I don't know. I just think I guess I just wanted your opinion on what you think the value of this can be and how these a school like this can help, and also having to do with exchanging information with other countries and vice versa. And if there could be some sort of summit conference, on certain things like wildfires or sea level rises and so on, where we can exchange it.
Yeah. Thank you. The question was about the role of education in climate displacement. I think that's a really important question. I think there's a lot of roles that education can play. Clearly, I came back from my PhD, believe in the value of learning here. I think at the stage of, there's value in using education to address climate displacement, I think, across all disciplines. Like there's maybe a strong interest amongst international relations scholars or political scientists to think about these challenges from a governance perspective, but I would love to see engineering programs. At the School of Sustainability here at Stanford, there's a lot of focus on technological solutions and physical infrastructure, and I think it would be really exciting to see what a policy lab or a different courses that are focused on climate displacement could be. I think interdisciplinary education is particularly critical on this issue, given that it has elements of built infrastructure and law and policy and social dynamics. I'm just thinking again about my aunt and uncle, and at this stage of housing decisions, wouldn't it be great if there was educational materials that everyone was presented with that said, okay, this is the risk of sea level rise in this potential destination you're considering purchasing a house. This is the risk of wildfires. And for that to come not from the insurance agency that might have other interests, but to come from, city council or another stakeholder. But that raises other challenges because no city wants to lose potential inhabitants. Their tax base is going to disappear when communities plan relocations. That's not something people want. So anyway, I think education is important in a formal university setting. Obviously, I think education is also really important in other settings.
We have two questions online. First of all, with the background of all of you that you have talked about tonight, what are you personally optimistic about in this whole milieu?
Yeah, Okay, that's it's a brilliant question. I think I'm really inspired and optimistic about how planned relocation can be done well. I think there are a few cases that are effective practice. But Gardy Sugdub, this one community in Panama, who I'll be visiting this week, is an example where an Indigenous community on their own decided, you know, we are going to pick up and move to a new place. And then they sought support from the government. And it's an example of a relocation that was truly community driven. And I think there's a lot to learn from what that process looks like in other places. I'm also optimistic when I talk to undergrads at Stanford. There's a lot of growing interest in this field. When I started working on these issues in 2013, the first climate change conference that I ever went to, COP20, there was one single side event focused on climate mobility, climate displacement. The most recent COP, there were 27 side events focused on this challenge. There are so many more media articles today than there were 10 years ago. There is a proposal now for the Dorr School of Sustainability to open a center on climate displacement studies. There's a lot of growing interest from students in the Stanford community and really everywhere in this issue. And I feel inspired by that growing momentum. And I think I'm most inspired about these future-oriented risk management adaptation approaches, more so than the let's put a Band-Aid on an arm that has gangrene and is broken approach, which is more of the humanitarian approach.
So the next question is relative to Fiji offering refuge to populations of low-lying island nations. So the question is the goal or expectation to recreate and maintain separate communities, or is it to absorb the refugees as Fijian citizens?
That's an excellent question. So this hasn't actually taken place yet. And in fact, the land that Kiribati purchased in Fiji is land for agricultural and economic stability, more so than physical relocation. So I don't have an answer. I don't think the government of Fiji has a plan for this. Internal relocations, the idea is often for there to be some assimilation, but when there's a cross-border question, unclear. Yeah.
Thank you.
I believe that the Fijian land has been offered was owned by the Catholic Church. So I think that the integration will just be like normal democratic nations. They'll have their own way of worship, and I think they're allowing the land to get out of the Catholic Church. Not so much, you know, the politician isn't hard to beat right now. It's more like the basic Christian movement. Something else I'd like to ask you about is, you understand that some of the refugees could be fleeing like violence in Mexico, for instance. I read in the magazines that the Ciudad Juarez across the border from El Paso cannot find policemen to take the job. There's no police, but they just so happen to have a holding place for refugees or migrants that were being captured, and they burned, you know, in the fire lately. So I just think that the backbone of law and the nationalism we see in Ukraine would show that you know, some of these things you can't run from. You have to, you know, try to stay and fight for your right, make it better.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a direct response, but I think the observations are very valid, and the role of faith communities it is something we see in other places beyond Fiji as well. I think Another example, post-typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, Tacloban City was decimated, and a lot of their planned relocations that occurred, the land was offered by churches, or the new sites, the new houses were provided by different church communities. And again, alongside UN agencies and governments, the faith community is a critical part of civil society.
How much applicability is there from the small communities in the Pacific Islands, in Alaska, that, you know, community organized and have moved at enormous expense? But what lessons out of that are really transferable?
Yeah.
The Miami goes underwater.
Yeah.
Houston, New York, has to be that New York, Shanghai. That moving them is an entirely different scale.
Yeah.
Politics are entirely different. The mention of FEMA, there is the free rider aspect of this. The two states in which FEMA spends the most money are Florida and Texas. Two states that spend essentially no money on dealing with their preventive measures to reduce vulnerabilities on this.
Yeah.
It will become a blue state, red state, size of the budget, size of the deficit, kind of question. So the examples you gave they're important, they're small.
Yeah.
How much of those lessons are really transferable?
No, I think you raised a really valuable point. A lot of them are not. These planned relocations are in really rural areas. They're really small communities, less than 500 houses. It's very different than trying to relocate Miami or New York. Another important factor is that the community cares about staying together. I don't know the names of my neighbors down the street, and if I move to a new home, I don't necessarily need them to be my neighbors in the new destination site. I think there's a lot of limits to how relevant the model of planned relocation will be. I think the individual household buyout approach, which FEMA has taken, makes a lot more sense in urban areas. The approach is, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with buyouts. Basically, you get a sum of money and then you get to decide where you move, where you buy a new house. But you're right. I think adaptation, this is a challenge that occurs across all adaptation to climate change. What is the right scale? What is the right unit of analysis? We see best evidence of success the smaller the scale. So when a solution is tailored to one community, often people will report better outcomes than if a solution has been tailored to a whole county. I guess it also depends on what type of solution, but that is something I've seen in the literature recently. Your point about red state versus blue state limited funding is real. I think one of the biggest ethical challenges in this field is how do you determine who to support with limited resources? And do you make those determinations based on who is most at risk, who is most exposed to these hazards? Or do you make those decisions based on historical inequities and injustice? Who has been redlined, who has been in affordable housing for generations? I think there's a lot of questions about how those decisions are made and a lot of trade-offs and no clear rules about how to make them. Yeah, but this will be a space to watch in generations to come.
Lou, do we have more online questions?
No, there are no more online questions, Tom.
Okay. We have more in the room.
There's no more. I just wanna-
Another observation.
I just read about Venice and the situation there with the what they didn't call it, a seawall of what do they call it, the barrier that's finally working there, that was intended to be used occasionally, when the water got too high, and now they're saying that it's more likely that we'll be let down occasionally. And as a result, the canals will all become uninhabitable, basically. And that's Venice, that's like a historical landmark city all by itself. And I've just been sitting here thinking about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think these are challenges we're going to face everywhere. It's not just about small and developing states. It's about Venice. It's about Miami. It's about San Francisco. And the solutions that work in each place will not be the same. We need a toolbox of challenges, a toolbox of solutions to fix a toolbox of challenges, I guess. Yeah.
Are there more questions?
You wanna come over, talk to the camera? Sorry about the blinking, TV, it was the question of resolution.
Okay, we've had a lot of good questions. But we seem to have hit a natural stopping point. And Erica mentioned that she's got a very early flight. So if there are no more questions, we'll say thank you for a stimulating and effective presentation. Thank you for joining the effort at sustainability and figuring out ways to deal with these. As a former longtime operator in government, the perfect is the enemy of the good, and the good is the enemy of the necessary. And I would encourage you as an individual, you as a program, to devote attention to what can we do now in specific places, with insurance, with people that live in the mountains of California or national forest land and say, you can't live there anymore because it costs too much to protect it, or your insurance isn't good there. We're not paying for beach houses to be rebuilt at the next hurricane. The things that can be done on it, but you've demonstrated how complicated this is, and every solution is going to generate 3 more problems. That the no magic bullet is an understatement. So thank you for doing this. A reminder to everybody that Great Decisions takes a hiatus next Sunday, but we resume the following Sunday with Abbas Malani, who will talk about Iran. Abbas is the director of the Islamic Studies, Iran Studies program at Stanford. So thank you, online people. Thank you, people in the room. And most of all, thank you, Erica. Lou, do you have any closing words?
No, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and stop the meeting.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erica.
Good problem.
That whole question.